Hello, I am John Brink, and we are podcasting on the Brink from central British Columbia, Canada. And for all those people that are saying, oh, we know where Canada is, and British Columbia on the west coast, right? Right. And we are in the center of British Columbia. Today, a very, very interesting podcast. It's about the BC forest industry in crisis session. Actually, it's more than that. It's probably Canada's forest industry in crisis, if not North American, and maybe even beyond that. And today we got a very, very special guest. His name is RUSS TAYLOR, and Russ has over 45 years of experience in the global wood products industry. I probably have known him for that many years as well, and he is a friend. RUSS TAYLOR is recognized as an authority in market analysis, industry benchmarking, and strategic consulting. His career has been part of the forest industry. In 1970, he began a career as an operational forester with the Northwood Timber, now Canfor, in Houston, the largest sawmill in the world at the time. Still is, but it's shut down. In 1980, he served as a sales manager for Interfor in Vancouver, overseeing custom cutting, remanufacturing, and product sales globally. Again, Interfor, very dominant company, also struggling with today's realities, actually. And in 1990 to 2010, for 20 years, he founded the International Wood Marketing Group for 28 years, including the establishment of China's China office, providing industry-leading market intelligence and strategic guidance. And today, he's published the RUSS TAYLOR Global document, and he has RUSS TAYLOR Consulting, and is very active again on a global level. So you just came from Sweden, from Finland, I believe, in Oslo, where there was a conference on the European market. Tell us about that, Russ, in terms of what's happening in Europe. And you just came back, actually, in the last day or two.
That's right. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation, John. Always good to be on with you and connect with you and hear your views as well. So I'm sure we'll hear some of that both ways today. And yeah, it's called the International Softwood Conference. It moves around every year. This year it was in Oslo in Norway. Interesting area of the world. Their industry is actually growing. They do a lot of log exports, all the things you're not really hearing about. And I would suppose when you talk about the forest industry in crisis in BC and Canada, North America, I would say in Europe as well, they're facing unprecedentedly high log costs. I mean, unbelievably high log costs in Sweden, in Finland, in Germany, in Austria, and we're not really sure why. The supply and demand is pushing the log prices up to levels that are uneconomic. And when we talk about, the log costs in BC, I don't know what the number is exactly right now, but $120 a cubic meter on average.
Yeah.
Open market wood more, and your own forest licenses less, but that's around $85 US a cubic meter. In Europe, they're looking at $140 US a cubic meter, and in some countries a lot more, depending what you're looking for. So that's especially for spruce. Spruce is very high priced. The pine is a bit cheaper, and now there's a bit more movement going after the pine. So when I was talking,
if I'm wrong here, Russ, the timber is very similar in the Scandinavian countries. If we're talking about Sweden, Finland, and Norway, we are very similar to ours in terms of SPF.
Yeah, very, very similar. I mean, they grow pine and spruce forests, and I would say, South Sweden, Germany are a little more similar to what we have. As you go further north into northern Sweden and Finland, the woods are a bit slower growing, a bit smaller, that sort of thing. But it's all spruce and pine, similar, not lodgepole pine, but Pinus sylvestris, red pine. And the spruce is Spruce is, I'm not sure about the spruce, but similar, very similar anyways, and similar applications as well.
So if we claim that, which we hear frequently, that we have the highest log cost in the world, that is not quite correct then, as we relate it to similar species in the European market, really, so.
Yeah, I mean, BC's, the term I always say is, well, BC does not have the highest log costs even in North America. The Pacific Northwest has higher log costs, but then what you get is you get a much bigger Douglas fir, very close to a highway and very close to a mill, and pretty close to and closer to markets. Where in BC we get a smaller log, farther away in the woods. Some of it could be beetle killed or fire killed, and it's a long ways to market. So we have a worse margin than the Pacific Northwest, but we don't have higher log costs because they're not really comparable. But on average, we don't do as well as the Pacific Northwest. And in Europe, they've always had the highest log costs. Typically, we would talk about $100 US. Now they're up to 140, 150. I heard 160 in some cases, depending on the quality. But the normal quality is what I talk about. And their lumber prices have not moved accordingly with the log price. So they're in the red. And some countries, like Sweden, for example, its currency has appreciated, because it's the Swedish crown, not the euro. It's appreciated 17% since January, negatively impacting their ability to hit export markets. So
their cost would be in Swedish crown, be going up where the market isn't, because of the EU being the common currency by and large, but their cost is going up. So a lot of those mills are not profitable either. Well,
they're worse than I thought. I thought they would be marginally negative, but they're very negative relative to Europe. And Germany also they had a subsidy, not a subsidy, but they had beetle-killed wood, spruce beetle-killed logs for a number of years now, and that supply is dwindling. So now they have to replace that with very expensive fresh logs, green logs, and that's with weak prices, they're really feeding the squeeze right now. So, and then they have tariffs to the U.S. market as well, so that's another roadblock for them in the short term.
So where does Russia come into the picture? Because contrary to what some people may think, is that the greatest volumes of timber really are in Europe, likely are in Russia. And so how do they fit into, and even when I spent the first, right up to the time that I was 24, I spent 7 or 8 years working for one of the larger importers in Western Europe, a company by the name of William Pond. And we used to import also from Sweden, Central Europe, and mainly from Sweden, but also from Russia. And again, the timber was very comparable to what we were used to out of Sweden and those kind of places. And so where does Russia come into the picture?
Yeah, and we talk about Russia as having 20% of the standing timber in the world, but a lot of that's not economic. But in terms of the big picture too, I mean, European lumber production, excluding Russia, is slightly smaller than the U.S. and Canada combined. It's huge. So they are very much selling into their own market, and then importers are coming in. So Russia was a fairly big importer or exporter to the European market for a long time until the sanctions kicked in. They would produce around 40 million cubic meters of lumber, so around 25 billion board feet, and about I think about 8 million cubic meters would end up in the European market, or maybe 10. So typically they would be about 10% of U.S. 10% of European consumption. So with the sanctions, that Russia or Europe is more starved for lumber on one hand, but the demand is weak, so they actually have an oversupply right now without the Russian lumber. And meanwhile, Russian lumber is going into countries that are not sanctioned, like China, like India, like Middle East, North African markets. Japan even is not sanctioning Russian lumber, so they're trying to move there. But about 70% of Russian lumber now goes to China at very low prices.
So that then being said, is that Russia, with all that 20% of the global volume of timber, and are not being charged duties by the United States either.
Well, they are. If lumber has a 35% import tariff as part of the sanctions.
Okay.
So the forest minister of BC commented that Canada now has a 45% penalty going to the U.S., whereas Russia only has 35%. So is that the end game, trying to attract more Russian lumber to the U.S. and prohibit the Canadian lumber? So anyways, that's just a comment.
Yeah, just a general comment, right? So the other part that I found interesting, and obviously we've seen in the news, is that BC, the government of British Columbia, maybe together with the federal government, are setting up a UK office to sell more of our product into the European market. And, because of the comments that you just made, that I believe would be a challenge in a way. The other part that reminds me, when I worked way back then in the early 60s in lumber in Holland, we got charged out of that a lot of times. We loved the Canadians because they liberated us, and everybody in Holland loves Canadians. And, and we did as well as in the forest industry. And their manufacturers, especially from northern British Columbia, would come frequently to Holland and make a case for importing dimension lumber, 2x4, 2x6, 2x8, 2x10, 8 to 20, 24, blah, 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 blah. And our comment, and they would then set up offices to convince the people in Holland to build stick houses like we do here in North America and in Canada. And we got a charge out of that a lot of times because they would come and make the case to sell lumber in Holland, and then until the U.S. market would come back again after it was depressed, and then they stopped selling any lumber. So that never amounted to much. And so the question is this one, so that has been the past reputation. What will they want to sell? Is it dimension lumber? And if that is the case, it likely would go the same as it did then. And or are they planning to do something different? And if I think about Sweden in particular, but also the other countries, Finland in particular, and Norway to a certain extent, in Central Europe, have gone away from commodity lumber becoming more specialized and value-added manufacturing, meaning not what we want them to buy, like what we do, is dimension lumber do the same as we do, but rather determine what do they want and what do they need, and that is the future market.
Yeah, what a concept, John. Instead of saying, here's what we make, how much do you want? Why don't you ask, what do you need? And let's see if we can produce it. But the BC industry has been always about pushing, 2x4s into markets. The difference is in Europe, though. I mean, the UK program is really there was a 1 7/8 program that's still alive, and so that's what Canadians targeted up through the in the 80s until the pinewood nematode came along and requirements for green lumber came in or dry lumber came in. That knocked out some of the green hemlock and Douglas fir. But so the SPF would be targeting, I think, the 1 7/8 CS16 or C16 C24 structural lumber program. For Central Europe, that's more of a struggle. Yeah, 2x4s are not needed or wanted. It would have to be something different. There is some programs I know in metric programs in Brussels, for example, or Belgium that are working in small volumes right now, but again, the biggest thing that I see is that if with the impediments in the U.S. market, with the duties and the tariff, a 45% issue or wall trying to get it across the border, if you want to go back into the global markets and try and push 2x4s, we've been trying for that for decades, and they don't really want it. We've had success in Japan with 2x4 platform homes, and that's still going strong. But demographics are going down, so the volumes are going down, as is BC production. So maybe it's a trade-off, but nevertheless, that's not going to be a growth market. China buys 2x4s, but low grade for concrete forming, and they throw it away. The rest of the world, little bits here and there. So my sense is that with this, so FII, Forest Innovation and Investment, Crown Corporation, I think it is in BC, with offices elsewhere in the world, mainly Japan, China, India, and Vietnam in particular. They are trying to now set up a kind of a new vehicle for looking at structural lumber in the UK, and perhaps what else can we do in Central Europe, but also Middle East, North African markets as well, because that's more of a lower grade market, but with some different grades. But if BC wants to expand, it's going to have to be looking, I think, more at some metric programs, which means how do we do that? Because we can do it. We can cut metric, but we'll get a lot of fall down unless you can sort your logs like the Europeans merchandise and sort their logs and batch everything through, and they can therefore make almost anything you want because of the way they merchandise their logs before they put it through the mill. We don't have log merchandisers. We have log sorts, and that gets us part way. But to be really effective, we probably have to have either a log merchandiser, which is a big investment, but it will reduce your low grade. It will get you more access to markets, but you need capital. And right now the industry has zero capital. So bad timing, I would say.
Isn't the other part something else that comes to mind, at least in my mind, since I spent part of my life, I started working in the forest industry as I was not academically very successful. I failed grade 3 and failed grade 7 3 times. And they said, let's make him, what should we do with this guy? Some people said, well, why don't you send him to the mentally challenged school? He said, no, we're not going to do that. So my dad had a friend that had a furniture factory, and say, well, let's make him a furniture maker. So they did. When I was 12 and a half years old, I started working in a furniture factory. Best thing that ever happened to me, because that changed my whole life in terms I've looked at lumber and lumber products and what else could we do. And when I first came here, when I was 24 years old in 1965, coming out of lumber manufacturing, and I climbed through the ranks fairly quickly, became very involved in the biggest importer of lumber in Western Europe that had about 35 different factories throughout Europe. And so when I came to Prince George, the first thing that I saw is the burner conveyors, and saying half the log is going up the burner conveyor. Yeah. And so, in fact, when they made the case for pulp mills here, nobody wanted to do a study on it, and saying that it was Ray Williston, then the Minister of Forest. This goes way back to the late 50s, early 60s. He was from Prince George, actually. And so a teacher, but very, very forward thinking. They needed to do a study of the recovery of fiber from logs, and they couldn't get anybody to do it until IFS, Industrial Forest Service, and our mutual friend, Bob Schutz, now the CEO of, they offered to do a study. And because they didn't have any money to do a study, to make the case that they should get pulp mills here built. And so it cost $200 to do the study. So they did that for free. And they were hoping to get paid, but they never got paid for it. So they offered that. And so, and what did it conclude? That we only used 25% of the log for lumber. The rest was waste. Wow.
Wow.
And so
Yeah.
that made the case for the pulp mills. And that was Industrial Forest Service that made that case and say, I not in this podcast, but I speculate how much is already covered today. But that's a different story altogether. But we're still not long far away from getting to where we need to go as we go forward. And and a good case would also be, at least in my mind, having been involved in BC and in secondary manufacturing. Last week we celebrated, if you want to call it that, 50 years when I started Brink Forest Products. Value-added manufacturing, which I thought was the future of the industry. Well, I'm still working on it today, and I get a kind of a chuckle out of hearing that the Minister of Forest, with all due respect to Ravi Palmer, who has done a great job for a young fella, and to a whole new industry, is going to Japan to see what can we do to establish markets there, and then the next thing, China. So, but you correct me if I'm wrong, you're the expert, but I lived it in a way, been watching it. Japan only buys high grades. They're not interested in mid grades or all the other stuff. And then China is the direct opposite. They're only interested in low grades. Both of those items should be further manufactured here in British Columbia. And so we still don't have that picture, and apparently we still don't, because that's what we are pushing now. And I believe still that the future of the industry is that 50% of the volume manufactured would go up the value chain, 25% of the high grades, 25% of the low grades, and 50% should be traditional dimension, if you wish. But so a lot has to happen for this industry to change direction to become globally competitive. It starts right with intensive forestry, going all the way back to different mindsets in terms of how we operate, further manufacturing, skill sets that we require, attracting entrepreneurship that will stimulate, attracting capital to invest. And I'm trying to be very hard to be an optimist, but it's not around the corner at this point until we change direction and say we have to have a strategy. We have the best forest in the world and the best location in the world. And so we need a strategic plan, not for the next 4 years, but for the next 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. What do we want the industry to look like? Where should it go from here? And should tenure be managed the way we're doing it now, which is not effective? And all those other things have to change, in my mind.
Yeah, we were certainly covering a lot of those topics. And I would agree that I think one of the handicaps, I think, and I did work, I did some government projects in the late 1990s about the value-added sector and what was right, what was wrong with it. And I remember I found that report recently, and it hasn't really changed much in 25, 30 years. It's still a struggling industry. It was back then, and we've got more struggles now. And part of it is if you're a value-added producer, and all that's produced is like 2x4s and 2x6s, you have to get creative as to what you can make. Whereas if you go into Europe, because they cut so many different sizes and grades, there's they cut like a furniture grade, they cut a structural grade, they cut an industrial grade, and they can different sizes, so they parcel it out all over the world. But what we do is we say, well, we make structural lumber. We don't really make out of the SPF in the interior. We don't make furniture grade or appearance grade. We make structural grade and make some industrial grade, which is kind of the low grades. But with the structural grade, you can't use that in furniture because what do they want in furniture? First of all, they want species separated. They don't want the mix. They want spruce and pine separated. They want it rough sawn, not smooth like plain lumber. They want it rough. They don't want eased edges. On the edges, they want square edges. They want moisture content maybe 16%, not 19%. and on it goes. So we can't really go after the furniture industry. And if, like in China, well, and according to my data, the construction market's been in a 5-year slump, and construction lumber is way down, and which is what we sell to China in the low grades. But the furniture grade is stable. It's relatively stable. And where is it coming from? Sweden, Finland, because Germany, because they cut metric sizes and furniture grade. So, and different qualities. New Zealand ships furniture grade into China, lumber. So, because they have the right sizes and the right grades. So, our industry can't promote the value added sector unless we start looking at different sizes and maybe more furniture grades. And then the fall down from furniture grades from a sawmill goes into a reman plant with the right size that could be used for end uses elsewhere. So that's the part we've never gone after, because the U.S. industry the market is so big. We don't need to do anything else but sell structural commodity lumber to the U.S. market. That's it. That's all we need. And so that's been the road map forever. And to be honest, the U.S. does need our wood. They import 30% of their consumption comes from outside of the U.S., 25% from Canada, and the rest from the rest of the world. So it's been an easy business. We used to have 35% of U.S. consumption coming from Canada. Now it's 25% because of our lower production. So they still need our wood. But if we let the U.S. government and Trump and so forth squeeze us out of the U.S. market, we've got to then do something different than what we're doing. And it won't be 2x4s into export markets, I can tell you that.
Exactly. And so then just bringing us to, so what is happening in terms of, correct me if I'm wrong, and again, going to basics, we have the best fiber in the world, in my opinion, in BC. Coastal is different than interior. Interior very similar to, as we talked about, Scandinavian countries, and to a certain extent the Central Europe. But then the difference between us and southeastern southern yellow pine is, again, the growth cycle about 30, 35 years, depending where they are. It's a different product. It's very difficult to work with, very sensitive to changes of climate. If you leave it sit outside, especially in the United States, it twists and crooks. And so it's suitable for some things like decking and other specialties, but not very good for building houses because it is more difficult to work with. I always say you have to drill it before you nail it. And so the growth lengths could well be this big, and so it makes it uniquely different. And so, but I like to say, and other people say different, it's like comparing apples and oranges. I said no, it's more like apples and lemons. So the comparison.
Right. Well, let me come back to the wood differences, but let me come back to your first comment, because I've heard government say this for years, that we have the best forests in the world and so forth, and you said that. If you travel around, you might change your opinion. When I travel to Sweden and Finland, and look at their forests, look at the way they're managed, look at the quality of the wood. Even in Germany, which is a faster growing, they've got big logs, big diameter, 30 centimeter logs, 25, 30 centimeter logs. They're straight.
Yeah.
Almost perfectly straight. They're second growth, where our forests are a lot more twisty and turny. They're kind of old growth forests. And so we don't actually have the best forests in the world, in my opinion. We have very good forests, and I'm not sure where the best is, but the qualities, we overestimate what our real quality is. We have good fiber. We should try and make the most out of that fiber, whether it's good or average or poor. And that's the advantage then we have, though, over the southern yellow pine. The southern yellow pine lumber, in the summer, in the heat, it twists and warps. It absorbs moisture, so it's not that stable. It's heavy. It's dense. It is hard to nail. You need a drill sometimes, and so about 60% of the southern yellow pine goes into treated lumber, which is a different application. It's niche. It goes into outdoor products. It goes into termite resistance on first floor walls and so forth. Right. So it's got a different application. But framing lumber, they prefer spruce or SPF, European spruce. It's lighter. It's easier to handle. It nails nicely. So that's what they're used to. And right now, if you look at the prices delivered to the U.S. South, the premium that the builder is paying for SPF over Southern Yellow Pine is a 50% premium. 50%.
Yeah, we don't see that though in the marketplace.
We're still losing money in BC, but they're still paying a 50% premium because they prefer the quality.
And that's the point. So coming back to you're a registered professional forester. You studied forestry and you got a master's in it. And so you have, and obviously you spend your time initially in the 70s as a forester, key forester for then Northwood. And so I'm not arguing the issues that you make on that part. Simply what I'm saying is this, Russ, is that I believe in the operative. You managed it. You mentioned managing the forest in Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Central Europe much different than we do. We are not good managers of our forest. And that's the key, at least in my opinion. We have the ability to be the same, if not better than anybody else, because of the climate, the location, especially in northern British Columbia, and the coast takes much longer, but the growth cycle is very similar to the Scandinavian countries. But we do, to say the least, trying to be respectful, a marginal job on managing it. We don't do enough. We leave too much in the forest. We must start with recognizing that our forest is a resource that is recyclable, but it must be managed, and we simply don't do that. There are examples where it is, and they are distinctly different in terms of growth per hectare, et cetera, et cetera.
And I've always said that, not always said, but my opinion is that the Achilles heel of the BC industry, even the Canadian industry, is public land ownership. This is what's showing up now with trade disputes and everything else. So when you go into, say, Sweden or Finland or even Germany, it's not public land. There is some public land, but it's like the U.S. South. There's some public land, but it's mainly private, forest landowner, co-ops, and so forth. And so the landowner wants full value for the wood, and so the industry has become more integrated with where the wood goes and creating more value from the wood and then creating more value from the forest. Thinnings, for example, are commonplace. Here, we can't get the Ministry of Forest to move very much on that, because that's not only does you get more fiber that's scarce right now, especially if it's commercial thinning, you create a stronger crop for the futures and you reduce your fire hazard. But government's not going to spend money on forests because all that money is going to get spent elsewhere. So what we're sort of left with is what I would call more of a silvicultural slum to some degree, rather than vibrant second growth forests. I mean, it's a bit of both, right? But I mean, we got all the fire damage, we got all the beetle air damage. A lot of forests are coming back naturally, not managed. In Europe, I mean, they have so many more foresters per volume of timber harvested because they want to manage it, and they can also get a faster rotation as they manage it too. They get more fiber off the land, and it's just so it's all the things you do in private and that's what private landowners do in North America, but in government forests, you don't see that at all, unfortunately.
It's like farming, right? So there is nothing magic about it. Do we have the right ground? Yes, the right location. All of that we do have, but we have some dramatic issues. They go directly to who is managing it, private ownership of forest, on et cetera, et cetera. So, but I just want to get to some other topics that I believe are very, very important, in particular talking about tariffs and duties. And obviously, this has been already part of the industry for a long, long time. if I go back probably for the last 100 years indirectly, but going back to the early 80s when duties came, really duty one came into effect, relatively minor, but directly going to the U.S. Softwood Lumber Coalition has been very effective in claiming that their membership is being disadvantaged by subsidies, handouts, and all of that kind of stuff in Canada. And that has created major problems for them. And they've been able to convince people in the Senate or the House to apply duties from that point forward right across the board. And they have gradually gone up over and higher into where we are now, as you mentioned earlier, looking at probably for all others and some other ones more, 35% duties is the reality today. And that may go to, as Trump the other day when he got up and was not happy about Ford, that introduced Ronald Reagan's feelings of tariff that are totally opposite from his, obviously, and he didn't like it. And so he hit Canada and said, we'll apply another 10% duties, which could mean, I always say, prepare for what you believe will happen, and then hope it doesn't. So that means in reality that duties likely will go to 45% for all others. Canfor in particular is one that is already at 55 or 57%. This would go to 67, and we are well on the way to where we have to pay them to ship lumber, just tongue in cheek, but it's becoming ridiculous because at the end they need our lumber. They need it. They need our aluminum. They need our steel. They need our autos. They need on and on and on and on and on. And so, but in the meantime, this is the reality that we are looking to. And I look around the industry where BC used to have about 120 sawmills. It's about half of that now. Yep. For now, and several new ones will go down or reduce, and especially the middle sector, the medium-sized companies, and we see it here. Sinclair's been an example, and on, and much more to come, in my opinion. Secondary manufacturing, which is special to me, when I was very involved in it in early 2000, we had as many as 800 secondary manufacturers throughout British Columbia. Now we probably have less than 25% of that. Northern BC, we used to have 40 of them. We have now 3 or 4, and at least 2 or 3 of them will not be there a year from now, and the other ones, including ourselves, wish we weren't. And that's where we are, because we don't see any daylight ahead.
Yeah, and I think, and unfortunately, these, again, just clarifying that, the duties, which is U.S. trade law, tied to no deal with the Americans, that's renewed annually, and right now those total 45%. And then under the Section 232 investigation, all countries were applied 10% for lumber. So now we're at 35% duties and 10%, so 45%, plus Trump's threatening another 10% on Canada, so 55%. But the U.S. trade law, they keep tweaking it and modifying it and so forth, so that now that not only do the commodity producers get stuck with the duties and the tariff, but secondary remanufacturers who add value with timber that doesn't come from tenures, they buy it on the open market, and they have much higher value. So the percentage they're paying, the full dollars, is huge. And that's going to really negatively impact the value-added manufacturers, unfortunately. And so go ahead.
Let me give you an example. Like for us, we have no handouts, 50 years in business, employed close to 400 people when we are normally operating up to a year ago. Right now, we're down to less than 100. But up to that point, for nearly 50 years, started in 1975 with very small, and then from then on growing up, no handouts, no subsidies, no timber, just relying on lumber as an input. So at one point we used to be exempted to pay on input values only. That meaning raw material going in. Example, if raw material costs would be $100 going into the plant and we add $900 worth of value, now we used to pay duty on the $100. Now we're paying it on the $1,000, and that has been devastating to a lot of companies. And putting it into perspective, since 2017, Brink has paid up to $88 million in duties.
Staggering.
That we should have never paid. And so what was the reason for it? Partially was Canada themselves and British Columbia. They didn't include in the last go-around negotiations, value added was not included. And so they just left it out because it kind of made things messy. And so, and that cost a lot of jobs in the forest industry and some other policy changes that we can talk about for another year or for another couple of hours. But so just staying with the duties thing, so that I believe that, as you do, is that once, obviously, housing starts, which normally single family housing being the metric, saying at 1.5 million starts annually, is probably less than half of that now, which will...
No, that's not correct, John.
Okay.
Yeah, just so you know, I saw you quoted that recently, but no, the housing starts are slightly higher this year, like 1% higher year to date. So they're going to end up being very similar, about 1.35 million housing starts last year, and about the same this year, and probably the same next year. So it's relatively flat right now.
So are those single family housing, or is it doors, or could it be a combination of all the above?
Well, that's single family and multifamily. And
so what I'm saying, but single family ones, I don't want to be argumentative about it, but so that's where I got the single family is the one that I was referring to. But anyway, that then being said, it makes me wonder then what has happened then to the lumber consumption if the housing starts are the same. And if I look now at the U.S. Southeast market is the worst right now, and the same in Canada, and a lot of the volumes of lumber, including ourselves, we just cannot sell into that market at any price, not including the duties, which is simply not possible. So what are they using then? Where does the lumber come from for all those houses now?
So what sort of the issue is that demand has been flat. Housing has been flat. Repair and remodeling, which is a bigger segment than housing, it's about 40% versus 35%. It's also flat, maybe slightly up, but no, overall the consumption is flat. But the problem is we have too much production. Even with the duties on Canadian lumber, we're still oversupplying the market. That's why the prices have plummeted. When the duties came on, instead of prices going up after duties came on, they went down. Too much supply, mills not willing to give up. And so right now we still have an oversupplied market. And that's why the southern yellow pine prices are below cost. SPF prices are way below cost. So we're waiting for supply and demand to balance out.
The challenge that I have is this one, Russ, is that here in northern BC, we shut down about 40 different lumber mills. And so if you look at the production that we had in 2000 versus now, am I wrong into suggesting that probably we used to have 120 sawmills, now we're down to about half of that? Is that so where does all the production come from? That's because we should be, if housing are virtually the same as they were before, then I look at it and saying, where does it go from here then? So that where does all the lumber come from?
And so what sort of happened is, like, I look at that big picture, and it's really interesting. So BC production is down over 50% since 2016.
Correct.
Down from what 15 or 14 down to 8. So we've lost about say 7 billion board feet. In the U.S. South since then, they've added about 8 million board feet. So you got negative 6 or 8 for BC and plus 6 or 8 for the U.S. South. Everybody else relatively flat. That's sort of what happens. All the growth has happened in the U.S. South, and all the declines have really happened in BC over the last 10 years. That's kind of what's happened. And even with all the closures in BC, that's been met with increases in the U.S. South. And they now have way too much supply, and that's why their prices are around break even or worse right now.
They are worse than that, right? Because if I look at West Fraser in the last quarter, they lost 240 million US in one quarter. And they're one of the best operators. And the same with Canfor is just absolutely devastating. And so, so it makes me kind of wonder as saying that with us being down to 50% of where we were before, and the same that companies like Canfor, West Fraser went to the U.S. Southeast, Interfor, and many, many others, and started to have the same approach to operations as they did in BC and in Canada. You crank up volume to the highest possible, with the result, obviously, of anti-dumping and all the other things that happened, and oversupply the market, regardless on to where it is. Even now, at the depressed whatever housing starts maybe, but it means the market is simply not there now. So where do we go from here then in terms of what should we be doing? And that ultimately becomes the question: where do we go from here in British Columbia, if not in Canada, across the board? Because politically speaking, Canada is, obviously Liberal government, and so their, focus is mainly in Quebec, Ontario, and then in the West, obviously after 10 years of NDP, which has been a bit of a disaster, to put it mildly. And then looking at Alberta, that is also challenged, but very similar to BC, have done forest policies that are much more proactive in longer term viability of the industry. And I've suggested that I believe there should be not separation, but at least an economic strategy between Alberta and BC working together, preferably under I usually try not to be political, but I got to in this particular case, under conservative government, because the NDP had 10 years to do it, and they screwed it up badly, and that now it's time for the change, although the delicate things in BC government, but still looking beyond that is saying that would it not make a lot more sense to have Alberta and BC work together on strategy involving natural resources, not only lumber, timber, but also oil and many of the other things that we have with pipelines, with obviously Kitimat and the rail system all the way from here going all the way into the critical parts of the United States in the medium to long term. Would that not be the best strategic direction?
Well, I think any strategy is going to be better than what we have now. And I suppose the challenge is with BC and Alberta. Well, BC's kind of timber supply scarce, over policy ridden, and Alberta's got a balanced timber supply and not a lot of government policies. But BC and Alberta can't get together on a pipeline, so I'm not sure how that could be. That's where things could stop. If they can't work together on a big mega project, other things are probably going to be harder to do, right? So that's why that may not work. But logically, we should be all working together, and I think that's I don't know how the politics work, but the political will doesn't seem to be there between the two provinces right now.
Well, to me, it's obvious, respectfully, the NDP and the Conservatives in Alberta, that will not match. That's a given. So what I'm saying that, but it's troubling to me now, looking at a political thing, the current government is south of Hope, and virtually have all the representation south of Hope, and north of Hope, where all the resources are. Probably what I usually say, correct me if I'm wrong on this one, is that 75-80% of all the natural resource or the GDP of the province of British Columbia is generated north of Hope. And so maybe that's not quite correct, but in a general sense, there is no representation here in the BC government. And so the focus will always be south of Hope, where the population is. But the resources and the future of the province and the GDP is north of Hope, in my opinion.
I would certainly agree, but I guess probably the issue is right now the BC government's shot itself in the foot with all these policies. The UNDRIP policy, they jumped the gun on that. Okay, it would have been in place eventually. They jumped the gun to look good, I guess. They put in the old growth policy to restrict the old growth, which, okay, you could have done something. They just did it all. You've got the landscape planning. You've got the First Nations programs. You've got the preserving 30% of BC's forests by 2030, up from 20%. So all these things are just handcuffing the Minister of Forests or handcuffing the industry, and we're all waiting for these policies to play out. And at the same time, we have all these tariffs and duties. So it's just kind of like it's a perfect storm of negativity, unfortunately, all at once.
And the same applies to, we all agree, and everybody says we need more value-added manufacturing, more value-added manufacturing. And at the same time, the policies are just the opposite, including organizations like COFI, which is basically controlled by the biggest do players, obviously, and are not very effective, at least not in my opinion. And so, that unless and until we have a longer-term strategy looking forward. What will the forest look like as we go forward in the industry? How do we attract entrepreneurship and capital in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years? Go do like what Sweden does. Intensive forestry means that we have to do thinning and all of those things they do in Sweden and in Finland. They do it at least once during a cycle, and in some cases 2 or 3 times during a cycle, which increases and on and on and on, all those kind of things. And then the other part is that, in terms of the U.S. Softwood Lumber Coalition, I believe they are very short-sighted in terms of what they are trying to do is obviously go far beyond attacking the primary sector. They are tackling directly the secondary sector and have gone one step further in terms of furniture makers and kitchen cabinets and all of those things, which is meant to be simply trying to do as much damage as you can to the industry and beyond. And I believe that is very short-sighted. The other part about it is that I was going to say, Russ, is that, for your opinion, is that I believe the $1.2 billion the government has suggested they would help, the forest industry in Canada, $700 million towards operating and $500 million towards further investment is relatively minor looking at the scope of the whole country. So how much will stay in Quebec, how much Ontario, if any, and BC, because it's all political in a way. And it could well be used by the coalition in saying subsidy. There you go again. And I believe where there is an opportunity, though, for them, in my opinion, I'm talking about federal government in particular, that have obviously control that, about in excess of $12 billion collectively have been paid by duties that are now sitting in Treasury in the United States, separate, collecting interest, that in some cases are being bought by investors at a substantial discount to generate cash for the operators that need it, that government can step in and lend money on the basis or finance that part because it's not part of the tariff things. It's being disputed correctly, in my opinion, and logically, that they can use all those funds to help existing industry in different areas using that 12 billion or a portion thereof, and both for primaries and secondary manufacturers to preserve at least part of an industry, because if this goes further than it is already now, which it likely will as we are now, there will be not much left of the industry, no matter how we like it and what opportunities and all these things that I talk about. It will take a generation, if not longer, to bring back confidence on entrepreneurship that will attract capital, like what Ray Williston did in the late 50s as the Minister of Forest, in hiring Industrial Forest Service here for a report that would cost $200 for a report to show all the fiber available to stimulate investment in pulp mills that created the pulp mills that we have today here in Prince George. That $200 study created that. And so that stimulated entrepreneurship, foresight from government at the time, foresight from Industrial Forest Service, and their history of more than 50, 60, 70 years. And that attracted the capital. And before we get back to this, we must have a strategic program looking forward, intensive forestry, starting with UNDRIP. I agree with you, is not the right idea, but the timing is wrong. You cannot give the tenure to a group of individuals, with all due respect to my friends in First Nations that do not have the entrepreneurship or the capital to start building the new generation of how do we manage the forest for the good of all, in Canada and in particular in the province.
Yeah, and I think really, I mean, all of that is what you're really trying to say is we have to kind of try and fix some of our problems, which is really difficult to do. Ultimately the fix is trying to get some deal with the U.S. on softwood lumber and other products so that we have some certainty, because right now, with all the uncertainty, no one's going to be investing in anything. And I don't think government's really going to get too excited about any industry, because the duties and the tariffs are negative on forest products right now. So it's more about a survival strategy the companies have to do. They can't do much, but ultimately, if they can do some sort of deal with the U.S., so we have, even if it doesn't matter what it is, some certainty, because right now, everyone that I've talked to, especially private companies, are just not prepared to invest a cent. They just want to try and survive. They want to hang on to their employees. And that's going to be a struggle with the way things are going. So it will get better, but who can afford to wait without some certainty? And hopefully the government, the federal government, can do something to kind of break the logjam with the U.S., because otherwise it could be a race to the bottom, unfortunately. And that's what the Americans really want. They're in no hurry to obviously negotiate, because they've got us, on the ropes.
So let's put it plainly that, we need to have the balls to stand up for one and speak out, so because they need us. And if we don't, then with Trump in the saddle and wanting to maybe even come back in 2028, so there is no short-term solutions. If he gets pissed off simply because Ford in Ontario had the balls to speak up and say, oh, what did Ronald Reagan think about this? And on the basis of that he said 10%. There we go, exactly. Get 10%. So if that's what we have, there are no short-term reasonable solutions. There aren't. Yep. And what you get now is the people that have invested big time in the industry, like Jimmy Patterson has and others, they are leaving the province. except for groceries, obviously, and all those other things, but with the forest industry. And then even for smaller operators like me that spent my life in the industry since I was 12 and a half years old, and had the dream of building a lumber mill in British Columbia, Canada, and for the last, and I'm going to be 85 next Saturday, 85 years young. So, and I'm an optimist. I will stay the course, but you can only go so far. And if I look at my company going from 400 employees down to less than 100 and wondering if we still be operating in the next couple of weeks. Fortunately, I have other companies like warehousing is doing well and real estate not too bad, that saying that, you know, I'm getting close to the point that I say, I can't do it alone. And so because the rest are not speaking up, other than you do, but not many others are.
Not many others as well. But I was curious too. Maybe John, you can explain what all these policies have done to your business, because obviously you were, as you said, you had 400 employees at one point in time, and now you're also struggling with duties and tariffs and lack of fiber and everything else too. So where are your operations at these days?
Where we are today, we still have, it's the Brink group of companies. We have 4 silos. The one silo is lumber manufacturing. The other silo is warehousing and distribution and logistics. That is growing and expanding. The third one is real estate, residential, commercial, and industrial. And then the other one is media. And so I am an author, as you know. I'm working on my 6th book. I'm a presenter in different occasions, and then I'm very active on podcasting. This one will become a podcast, will be released in 2 hours actually. I just got 1 million subscribers on YouTube, and we intend to set up a platform. So looking forward, I still believe in the forest industry. As you know, I was the longest serving director on coffee, mainly controlled by the majors, trying to change direction. About 1.5 years, I threw in the towel. I said, I can't do it. So that obviously they wanted to maintain the status quo, which they basically have. And I don't support that. It's not good for the industry of any sort. And then, the other one is with government policy in British Columbia. I don't think, with all due respect to Ravi Palmer, I don't think they have the picture, and value added is not part of the dialogue now, and it has to be, and it will be. So we're working with First Nations to work with them closely as we can. I keep doing that, but they will get substantial portions of the timber in British Columbia, probably 20 to 30%, and they are on the way, but they can't do it on their own. They need entrepreneurship, they need capital, and people that can make things happen, like me. And, they can't do it on their own. And they realize that, and I believe, but still there's potential better. So from my perspective, at nearly 85, I want to live till I'm about, 104 or so. I'm just kidding. But stay fit, stay healthy, and be an optimist, and speak out about issues. And that's kind of what I'm doing.
Yeah, and I think that's really good, John. And I think, unfortunately, all the things we've been talking about are all these negative things that are hitting us in the face, left, right, and center. So it will get better, but it's just kind of like, what's the catalyst going to be, and how does government move, and how does industry move, how does value added move to survive against this barrage of attacks from the U.S. side? And they've done their homework really well. They've got a protectionist president. They're going to get all the subsidies in the world to raise prices in the U.S. market. The consumer's going to pay, and eventually when prices get higher enough, we can get back into business. But that's a bit of a waiting game when we have no control over that. And it seems like all we can do as an industry is curtail, get supply and demand back into balance so prices can go higher. And that's not a great strategy, unfortunately, but that seems to be the short-term one.
Yeah, the challenging part, in my opinion, Russ, are that if we have to build new infrastructure, new sawmills that are dealing with the market, not if what we want them to buy is dimension lumber and build houses like we do, but manufacture products that they want and need. Examples are Sweden, Finland, and the Scandinavian, Germany, all the people that you listened to in Oslo when you were there, they have a model that works, although they have challenges, but with substantial higher prices for timber, they still, although they are losing money now, obviously, but they still have the right model. We don't even have the right model at this point. So we have to start back from there before we will attract capital in. We have to understand it first. You must have a strategic plan. How do you go forward in terms of forest policy? Then the next one, you must have a strategic plan with the U.S. Softwood Lumber Coalition, or at least portion thereof, in the United States, that is of mutual importance to do the right thing for us collectively in North America, as we have done for the last 100 years, and work towards that. In terms of the President of the United States, God only knows what will happen tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think too, the one thing I would sort of, when you go to Europe, and we had a sawmill tour as part of the conference in Norway, and what's interesting is you see the sawmills. When you talk about value added, the sawmills are making value added lumber in the sawmill operations, and we saw an example of that where one company's making short component lengths for house builders, and they have a tray system where they can package them all up live in different sizes and lengths in a package, and it goes so no one touches it, and ends up being packaged and goes to the builder just in time. And so value added production out of a sawmill is a bit rare in BC. There are some mills doing some value added production, but for the most part, it's commodity dimension lumber to the U.S. market, now caught in a trade war. And that's now we have to go into a survival strategy just to get volumes available to the remaining remanufacturers that are waiting for lumber that they can process. So it's a real issue right now.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Like value-added manufacturing should be done at the sawmill level, as well as entrepreneurship, where they work together in strategic relationships. But first and foremost, we have to identify the markets as to what they want and what they need. Not saying they must buy our 2x4s, So, and we're still not quite there even. But the primary sector will change rapidly here because of the policies in the United States and globally. They will have to change. And I'm staying the course. I'm not going nowhere. I'm doing my best. I'm going to stay, positive as much as I can and stay vocal about it. I still believe. I love Canada. I love British Columbia. And I see a great, great future, and I love being here. And Russ, this was an interesting hour and 10 minutes, actually. We covered a lot of ground, and as I indicated to you, we will release this podcast as it was presented in the next 2 hours, and it's available, and it's always a good time to have a discussion with you. I have a great deal of respect for what you have accomplished over the last 50 years, and for us being friends as well. I have a great deal of respect for you and your understanding of the marketplace globally, and looking forward to see where do we go from here and being proactive.
Yeah, been really good to hear your insights. And again, congratulations on your 50th anniversary, because that says a lot right there. And congratulations on being 85 soon, and because that says a lot too. And you're still in the industry, still willing to invest, and still willing to shake the flag and make things happen. So that's really good. There you go. That's the one.
Staying fit and healthy, living young, dying old. So, and then the other one is very, very important. My last book that I wrote came out July 31st, The $1 Billion, and it's about communication skills.
Okay.
And it's not about how to become a billionaire, although you can, but you will not become successful and become a billionaire unless you have communication skills. And that's what we talk about here, is the importance of communication skills. And certainly you are an example of that part as well.
Yeah, and vice versa. So anyways, it's really good to catch up again, John. And until next time then, hopefully you have some better news.
Well, we live in the best country in the world, so that's our fear. Thanks, Russ.
Hey,
Take
thanks,
care.
John. Appreciate it.
Thanks again for having you.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.